He didn't even look at her when he did it. That was the part Seraphine Arden-Villiers would carry longest. Not the words, not the room full of witnesses, not the sound of crystal glasses going quiet one by one as 300 of the most dangerous people alive turned to watch. It was the fact that Dante never once looked at her face. He raised his champagne toward the woman in the red dress standing at the far end of the head table, smiled the smile that had once made Seraphine believe she was chosen, and said it like he was reading a weather forecast. "The woman who will stand beside me from this night forward." Seraphine's fingers went cold around her glass stem. If you were standing in that ballroom tonight, surrounded by enemies wearing tuxedos, watching your husband hand your life to someone else, what would you do? Hit the like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what happens next in parts 2 through 5 will leave you unable to stop watching. Every part drops this week. Don't miss a single one. Now, let's go back to the night everything changed. The Belladonna estate had stood for over a century on the bluffs above the Adriatic coast, its limestone walls sunk into the hillside like old teeth. The Sovereign Syndicate Summit was held there every year at the turn of autumn, not because anyone loved the place, but because everyone feared it equally, which in Mafia terms passed for neutral ground. The chandeliers were original. The wine was French. The conversations were conducted in 11 languages and never fully finished, always trailing into silence right before the part that mattered most. Seraphine had arranged the seating herself, as she had every year for the past 9 years. She knew which families needed a buffer between them and which ones needed to feel honored enough by their placement that they wouldn't start trouble before the main course arrived. She'd spent 3 days on that seating chart. She had placed the Mariscotti brothers near the east windows, because Aldo Mariscotti had a weak knee that bothered him when the draft came through the main doors. She'd put Carla Vega at the center left, because Carla read the room from the middle and needed to feel like she was seeing everything. Small things, the kind of things that kept blood off the tablecloths. Nobody knew she did any of it. That was the arrangement, had been since the beginning. Dante walked into the room the way he always did. 3 seconds late, not 4, because 3 was commanding and 4 was arrogance you couldn't afford. And the crowd adjusted itself around him like water around a moving boat. He was not an enormous man, he was not the tallest or the heaviest or the most decorated. What Dante Valieri had was a quality Seraphine had once found magnetic, and now recognized as something closer to a talent for making everyone in the room feel slightly less certain of themselves. He wore it the way other men wore cologne. She had loved that once. She watched him move through the crowd from her position near the end of the head table, greeting the Kowalski family from Warsaw, giving Mariscotti a firm double handshake that the old man accepted with visible relief. Dante knew how to make people feel seen. That had never been in question. The problem, the slow, grinding problem she had assembled piece by piece over the last 4 years, was that his ability to make people feel seen had an order of priority, and she had been sliding down it without ever being told. The woman in the red dress arrived on Dante's arm at 7:42. Seraphine had known about Celine Voss for 14 months. She had not known about her the way a suspicious wife knows, checking phones, hiring investigators, going through pockets with shaking hands. She'd found out the way she found out most things. Someone told someone who owed her a favor, and the information arrived in a plain envelope slid under her office door with no return address. She'd read it, folded it, put it in the fireplace, and then sat for 40 minutes watching the paper curl and blacken. She had not cried. She wasn't sure, even then, whether that was strength or just the absence of surprise. Celine Voss was 31, a decade younger than Seraphine, the kind of beautiful that required work and money and a total willingness to be looked at. She had the carriage of someone who had always been rewarded for her appearance and had organized her personality accordingly. Not stupid exactly, but oriented entirely outward, toward impression. She laughed when Dante said things. She touched his sleeve. She made him feel like the smartest man in any room, which was, Seraphine had come to understand, the one hunger in him that never got full. What Seraphine had not anticipated was tonight. She had thought, if she was honest with herself, and she was brutally, that the affair would eventually exhaust itself, that Dante would come back to the architecture of their life together because he was, at the core of him, a man who understood the value of structure. She had built that structure. She had made it invisible so he could stand on it without feeling the weight of the work underneath. She had believed, for longer than she should have, that he understood this even if he never said so. The moment Celine sat down in the chair that had always been Seraphine's, the chair to Dante's immediate right, the one that faced the room, Seraphine understood she had been wrong. Not about Dante, about what she'd been willing to accept. She sat 2 seats down, moved there without a word, without anyone asking her to move. Just slid her place card quietly and sat with her hands folded and her face arranged into the expression she had spent 9 years perfecting, attentive, gracious, utterly unreadable. 3 people caught it. Carla Vega, who missed nothing. Yusuf Tamboli from the Mumbai Confederation, who had worked with Seraphine directly on 2 ceasefire negotiations she was never formally credited for. And old Marascotti, who had been at enough summits to know when a seating arrangement was an act of war. None of them said anything. Dinner proceeded. 7 courses. The lamb was overcooked on the edges because the kitchen had been rushing, which Seraphine noticed and which bothered her more than anything else that evening because she had specified medium and somebody hadn't listened, and it was the kind of small failure she could do nothing about from her position at the table. She drank water, she ate the fish and left the lamb. She answered questions from the Delacroix representative on her left with complete, accurate information about Adriatic port scheduling, which was the reason he'd specifically requested to sit near her. She did not look at Dante. She did not look at Celine. At 9:15, Dante tapped his glass. The room quieted the way rooms do when the person tapping carries the kind of authority that makes sound optional. He stood. He had prepared remarks. She could tell by the way he held himself, the slight forward lean that meant he was reciting rather than speaking. He spoke about legacy, about the future of the syndicate, about what it meant to build something that outlasted the men who built it. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. Then his eyes moved to Celine. There are moments, Dante said, when a man understands what he has been missing, what his life has been built without. Seraphine set her water glass down. And when he finds it, Dante raised his champagne, and his voice carried across the entire room without effort, 300 people holding perfectly still. He does not wait. He does not pretend. He stands before everyone he respects and names the woman who will stand beside him from this night forward. The silence that followed was not the silence of approval. It was the silence of 300 people processing something that had just violated a protocol so old it existed before any of them were born. Seraphine looked at her wedding ring. It was a narrow platinum band with a single oval-cut diamond. She had chosen it herself because Dante had given her the option, and she had taken it, which in retrospect she understood as the first signal about the nature of their marriage. He was generous with options, as long as he controlled which options were available. The ring had never been loose. It had never been uncomfortable. She was not in the habit of removing it. She pulled it off with 2 fingers, set it on the white tablecloth beside his champagne glass. Stood. Walked across the room. She didn't walk fast. She didn't look at anyone. She did not slam the double doors at the far end of the ballroom. She pushed them open with one hand and walked through, and the sound of her heels on the marble beyond diminished evenly until it disappeared. The double doors drifted shut. The ballroom was completely silent. Dante was still standing, champagne raised, the sentence unfinished somewhere behind his teeth. Celine's hand was on the table. Yusuf Tamboli had placed his napkin on his plate. Carla Vega had pushed her chair back slightly from the table, the smallest preparatory motion, as if she was considering standing. Then Aldo Marascotti stood. He was 73 years old and moved slowly due to the knee, and he took his time getting up, and he looked at Dante without expression as he reached for his jacket and walked toward the doors. He didn't say a word. He simply left. Carla Vega rose next. Then Yusuf Tamboli. Then, one by one, in the specific and terrible silence of a ritual none of them had planned, every patriarch, every queen pin, every cartel seat holder and confederation head and underboss with enough rank to have been at the head table or near it pushed back their chairs and walked toward the double doors. Not running, not making a scene, just leaving. It took 4 minutes for the room to empty. Dante stood at the head of his own table with his champagne still raised, watching his empire vote with its feet, and he did not yet understand what he was seeing. He thought it was a protest. He thought someone had organized it, some coordinated humiliation, some move against him dressed up as moral outrage. He thought this because the alternative, that 300 of the most self-interested, ruthless people alive had done this entirely on their own, for her, was not a possibility his mind was built to hold. Celine said nothing. Her face had gone the color of the tablecloth. The ring sat beside his champagne glass. Small. Narrow. Nothing dramatic about it. He picked it up. He stood there alone in the room that was supposed to have been his greatest moment and held a ring that no longer meant what it once had. And for the first time in longer than he could measure, Dante Valieri had no idea what to do next. Outside, in the cobblestone courtyard where lanterns swung on iron chains in the autumn wind, the gathered families of the underworld stood in loose, careful groups. Nobody was organizing anything. There was no meeting being called, no new leadership structure being announced. They simply stood where Seraphine had walked, in the space she had left behind, and they waited, not for orders, but out of something older and harder to name than loyalty. She was already gone. Her black car had pulled away from the estate gates 4 minutes after she walked through the ballroom doors. The driver didn't need to be told where to go. She had 3 phones in her bag. She took out the first one, sent a message that consisted of 4 words, and then set it down on the seat beside her and looked out the window at the coastline moving past in the dark. The message reached 22 people simultaneously. None of them were Dante. Inside the estate, behind the locked door of the Summit's secondary office, a locked fireproof cabinet contained a server that Dante's IT security chief had installed 14 months ago, after a mid-level captain had raised concerns about data fragmentation across the syndicate's communication infrastructure. The security chief was thorough and competent and had swept the room for listening devices 3 times before beginning installation. He had not checked the electrical conduit behind the south wall. On the 3rd shelf of the cabinet, tucked between a battery backup unit and a redundant router, there was a hardware device the size of a deck of playing cards. It had been there for 11 months. It had never transmitted anything without authorization. It never would, because it wasn't designed for interception. It was designed for access, meaning the person who had placed it there could, at any time, open any file on any machine connected to that network as if she were sitting at the keyboard herself. She had not used it yet. She had not needed to. In the car moving through the autumn dark, Seraphine Arden Valieri looked at her left hand. The skin where the ring had been was slightly lighter than the rest of her finger. The indentation was shallow, but visible. She pressed her thumb against it once. Then she looked back out the window. The coastline disappeared behind a hillside, and the car descended toward the city, and somewhere behind her, in a room full of empty chairs and cooling food and a champagne flute. Nobody had finished. The man who had spent 9 years standing on a foundation he never once looked down to examine, began to realize, slowly, with the particular dread of someone who has just found a crack in something they assumed was solid, that the ground beneath him had been someone else's work all along. He just didn't know how far down the crack went. He would find out. The car reached the city at 10:15. Seraphine didn't go to the apartment in the Valieri Tower. She didn't go to the villa outside the city that Dante had purchased for her 5th anniversary and which she had quietly registered under a separate holding company 3 years ago, a precaution she had taken without fanfare and without telling anyone, the way she did most things that mattered. She went instead to a building 12 blocks from the waterfront, a narrow 6-story structure with a dry cleaning business on the ground floor and a hardware distributor on the second. The upper floors had no commercial listing. The elevator required a key card issued to nobody on any Valieri payroll. She let herself in on the 4th floor, set her bag on the kitchen counter, and stood in the dark for a moment before turning on a single lamp in the corner. The room was not luxurious. It was functional. 2 desks, a wall of mounted screens currently dark, a small kitchen, a couch with a wool blanket folded over one arm. There was a plant on the windowsill that had been watered recently by someone other than her. Beside it, a notebook, open, with handwriting she recognized as Yusuf Tamboli's. He'd been here before her. She was not surprised. She changed out of the evening gown in the small bathroom, folded it once, left it on the edge of the sink, and came back in dark trousers and a gray shirt she kept in the wall cabinet for exactly this kind of situation, although she had not known, exactly, that tonight would be this kind of situation. She had known something was coming. She had not scripted it. That was the difference between her and the people who underestimated her. She didn't script outcomes. She prepared conditions, and then she watched what the conditions produced. Tonight had produced something faster and more total than she had calculated. She sat at the left desk, opened the laptop, and began to work. 3 blocks away, in the kitchen of a restaurant that technically belonged to the Delacroix family, but whose back room Aldo Mariscotti had used for private meetings since before the Delacroix were relevant, 12 people sat around a table with no food on it. The plates had been cleared, the wine had not been opened. Mariscotti sat at the head with his bad legs stretched under the table and his hands flat on the wood, and nobody spoke first because nobody was sure yet what they were agreeing to by being in the room. Carla Vega broke the silence. He just said it, in front of everyone. Nobody responded because there was nothing to add to that. 9 years, said Yusuf Tamboli. He had his phone face down on the table and hadn't touched it since sitting down. 9 years she held the Adriatic Compact together, the Kowalski Truce, that was her. The Marseille situation in 21, that was her. Every time something was about to go sideways and then mysteriously didn't, it was her. He didn't know, said a younger man at the far end of the table. Ronaldo, one of the Mariscotti nephews, 27 and sharp enough to be dangerous, but not yet old enough to know when to be quiet. Mariscotti looked at him. Of course he knew, the old man said. He chose not to count it. That was the end of that particular conversation. Back at the Belladonna estate, Dante had not moved from the ballroom for 11 minutes after the last guest left. Celine had tried to speak to him twice. The second time, he'd put his hand up without looking at her. Not aggressively, not cruelly, just the flat stop signal of a man who needed the inside of his own head to be quieter than it currently was. She stopped talking. He walked to the window that overlooked the courtyard and stood there. The lanterns were still swinging. The cars were gone. The cobblestones were empty and wet from a fog that had come in off the water, and they reflected the lantern light in moving orange ripples. And Dante stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and felt the specific weight of a room that had been full and was now empty, and thought about what that meant. He wasn't there yet. He was close, but not there. What he told himself, standing at that window, was that it had been a calculated insult, that someone, or several someones, had organized the walkout to humiliate him in retaliation for something, some business dispute or power play he hadn't yet identified. The alternative explanation, the one trying to surface in the back of his thinking like something floating up from cold water, he pushed back down. He was good at that. He had always been good at that. He turned from the window and looked at Celine. She was sitting now, her wrap pulled around her shoulders, her champagne untouched. The red dress that had looked like a statement an hour ago looked, in the empty room, like a costume. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Not fear, exactly. Something more like the awareness of standing near something that was becoming unstable. "Go back to the city," he said. "Dante, I'll call you tomorrow." She left without arguing, which told him she was smarter than he sometimes remembered. The door clicked shut. He listened to her heels on the marble, the distant sound of a car starting, and then silence. He took out his phone. His operations director, a compact, methodical man named Ferris, who had been with the syndicate for 16 years, and who had once, in a moment of unusual candor, told Dante that he admired him more than any man alive, answered on the second ring. "I need everything on the walkout," Dante said. "Who coordinated it? Who reached out to who beforehand? I want surveillance footage from the estate grounds. I want phone records for every person who was in that room, and I want a name on my desk before breakfast." A pause on the other end. "The footage is already being pulled," Ferris said. "But Dante, I've been making calls since I left the estate. I can't find any coordination, no communication trail. No one spoke to anyone else before it happened." Dante was quiet. "That's not possible," he said finally. "I know," said Ferris. The call ended. Dante set the phone on the table and looked at the ring still sitting beside the champagne flute. He picked it up, turned it once in his fingers, and then put it in his jacket pocket and walked out. By the time he reached the city, 3 things had happened that he did not yet know about. The first, 2 of his 4 primary offshore accounts had been frozen. Not seized, frozen. The distinction was technical and important. Seized meant a government agency had moved. Frozen meant the financial institution itself had declined to process transactions, which required either a court order or a request from a named account authority. Dante was the named account authority. He had not made any request. The second, a shipping arrangement for 40 crates moving through a port in the south of the country had been quietly rerouted. The containers were not lost. They existed. They simply now had a different final destination, registered under a logistics company that did not appear in any Valieri filing. The third, Luca Crane, who had been Dante's head of internal security for 11 years, and whom Dante trusted more than almost anyone alive, had received a message at 10:48 in the evening. He read it twice, deleted it, and then sat alone in his car outside his apartment building for 20 minutes without going inside. None of these things announced themselves. They were quiet. They were the kind of moves that looked like technical glitches and administrative errors until you laid them side by side and looked at them as a pattern. And by the time you saw the pattern, you were already 3 moves behind. Dante arrived at his tower apartment at midnight and found Ferris waiting in the lobby. Ferris looked the way he always looked: pressed shirt, measured expression, the face of a man who processed problems rather than felt them. But his collar was open by one button, which for Ferris was the sartorial equivalent of screaming. "Tell me," Dante said. They went upstairs. Ferris spread 4 printed pages on the dining table and walked Dante through what they had, which was not much and was simultaneously too much. The account freezes. The rerouted containers. 3 safe houses in the Eastern District that should have had rotating occupants and were, according to field check, completely empty and had been for at least 48 hours. 48 hours. Dante sat down. "This started before tonight," he said. "Yes. Before the summit." The container rerouting was logged Thursday. The account freezes processed at 9 o'clock this evening, which is during the dinner. Dante pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. "While I was standing up." Ferris said nothing. "Who?" Dante said. "We don't have a name." "Then what do we have?" Ferris hesitated, which he almost never did. "We have a pattern that suggests someone with very deep familiarity with your infrastructure, not someone who hacked in, someone who knew where to go." Dante stared at the papers. "An insider." "The access point suggests someone who was trusted at a level above captain rank, above director rank." The room was very quiet. "I need the short list," Dante said. "Everyone who had that level of access. I want them brought in for questioning, tonight." "That's a list of 7 people," Ferris said. "Then bring in 7 people." What Dante did not know, could not have known, sitting at that table with his collar loosened and his certainty beginning to fray at the edges, was that only 2 of those 7 people had actually done anything. And neither of them had done anything wrong by any measure he would have respected 2 years ago, before he confused his comfort with his authority. The next morning moved fast and badly. The first captain brought in for questioning, a veteran named Souza, who had run the southern port operations for 8 years, lasted 40 minutes before Dante's frustration collapsed into something uglier. He didn't touch the man. He didn't need to. He had a way of applying pressure through stillness and silence, and the specific quality of his attention that most men found worse than shouting. Sousa came out of the room, pale and shaking slightly, and told Ferris in the hallway that he had nothing to tell because he had done nothing, and Ferris believed him and didn't say so. By afternoon, 2 more captains had been questioned. By evening, the word had spread. In the compressed, phoneless way that information moved through the underworld when people were being careful, that Dante Valieri was conducting a purge. The word was not accurate. It was not yet a purge. But perception in this world moved faster than fact, and the perception landed like a stone in still water and sent rings outward in every direction. 3 more safe houses went dark by nightfall. A financial contact in Frankfurt, who had processed Valieri transactions for 6 years through a series of shell companies, sent a brief message to the Valieri accounting office, informing them that due to restructuring, he would no longer be available for their business. The message arrived at 4:47 in the afternoon. By 5 o'clock, 2 other European contacts had sent near-identical messages within minutes of each other. Ferris put the 3 messages side by side on his desk and stared at them for a long time. He did not bring them to Dante immediately. He needed first to understand what he was looking at, because what he was looking at had a shape. And the shape implied coordination, and the coordination implied a timeline that began well before the summit and extended far beyond any single act of spousal revenge. He had known Seraphine Arden Valieri for 9 years. He had found her, in the way that men in his position tended to find the wives of powerful men, essentially invisible, pleasant, composed, clearly intelligent, clearly not read into operations at any level that would make her relevant to his work. He was sitting at his desk revising that assessment with the specific discomfort of a man who realizes he has been wrong about something for a very long time. On the fourth floor of the narrow building near the waterfront, Seraphine was on her second phone call of the day with Yusuf Tamboli. The first had been logistical. This one was different. "He's moving against his own people," Yusuf said. "Souza, Brennan, the Ortega brothers. None of them had anything to do with any of it. I know. He's going to push them toward us. I know that too." A pause. "Is that intentional?" Seraphine looked at the screen in front of her. Port Logistics, 3 columns of numbers. A name highlighted in yellow that she'd flagged 2 days ago and hadn't acted on yet. "I made conditions," she said. "I don't control every outcome." "There's a difference," Yusuf said carefully, "between not controlling an outcome and not anticipating it." She didn't answer that. "Carla wants to meet," he said. "Tell her Thursday." "She'd prefer sooner." "Tell her Thursday," Seraphine said again, and ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Outside the window, the city was moving in its ordinary way. Trucks, pedestrians, the sound of a delivery door clanging shut on the street below. Normal sounds. The kind of sounds that existed completely outside the world she had been navigating for 9 years. A world that operated in the gaps between the normal sounds and never broke the surface if it was managed correctly. She had managed it correctly. Nobody had ever thanked her for that. She had not expected thanks. What she had expected, and this was where she had been wrong, the one place she could see her own miscalculation clearly now, was that competence would be recognized even if it wasn't named, that the absence of disaster would register as something, even without attribution, that Dante would understand, at some level of himself deeper than pride, that the peace he moved through was not ambient, it was built, rebuilt constantly, with her hands, in the dark, while he was in the light being admired. She had been wrong about that. She was not wrong about much. Being wrong about that had cost her 9 years. She picked up the third phone, the one she used for a category of contacts she had never discussed with anyone, and sent a message to an address that resolved to a server in a country that did not cooperate with international financial investigations. The message was 6 words. The response came back in 4 minutes. She read it, closed the phone, and went to the window. Below, a produce truck was double parked in front of a restaurant entrance, hazard lights blinking. The driver was arguing with someone on the sidewalk, gesturing broadly, the argument clearly going nowhere. The kind of small, friction-full human problem that resolved itself or didn't, and either way changed nothing consequential. She watched it for a moment, felt something that wasn't quite comfort, but was adjacent to it. The reminder that the world contained ordinary things, and that she was still in it, and that she had made choices she could stand behind even when they were hard to look at directly. Her wedding finger was bare. She had not put anything on it. She turned back to the desk. At 9 that evening, Dante received the report he had been waiting for. It had been compiled by Ferris with assistance from 2 analysts who had spent the preceding 16 hours cross-referencing access logs, financial transaction trails, and communication metadata across 6 years of archived data. Ferris delivered it in person. He set it on the table and stood back and said nothing, because the document said everything it needed to say, and adding words would not help. Dante read the first page, set it down, picked it up, read it again. The document was 43 pages long. The first page contained a summary. The summary described, in the flat, careful language of a man who had written it. Knowing the person reading it was going to react badly, that the pattern of access evident across the compromised accounts, rerouted assets, and evacuated safe houses was consistent with a single architecture, not multiple actors. One intelligence, one decision-making structure that had been operating in parallel with the Valieri syndicate for an indeterminate period. And then, on the first page, the sentence that Dante read 3 times before he accepted that it said what it said. The earliest traceable instance of this parallel infrastructure predated his marriage by approximately 6 months. He looked up at Ferris. 6 months before, he said. Yes. She didn't build this after the summit. No. She didn't build it after she found out about Celine. The evidence suggests Ferris stopped. Reorganized. No, she didn't. Dante set the report down on the table very carefully, with both hands. The way you set down something breakable that you are only now realizing is breakable. He looked at it. He looked at his own hands. He looked at the ring he had taken from his jacket pocket at some point in the last 24 hours and placed on the table beside his coffee cup, and he realized he had been carrying it around without meaning to, which was the kind of small, unconscious thing that told you something about where your mind was even when you were telling yourself it was somewhere else. He had believed, without ever examining the belief, that he was the architect. He had believed, without ever looking at the foundation, that the ground was solid because he was standing on it. Ferris said, quietly, "There's more." Dante looked at him. "Page 11, Ferris said. "The Adriatic Compact, the Kowalski Truce, the Marseille situation." He paused. "All of it. Every negotiation that held in the last 9 years. Every blood feud that didn't become a war. Every political contact that stayed bought and didn't flip. Every shipment that made it through without interception." Another pause, longer. "The documentation of her involvement in each one it's thorough. She kept records." "She kept records," Dante repeated. "On everything, going back to the beginning." He understood then, with the specific clarity of someone who has just reached the bottom of something and felt it under his feet, why she had walked out without arguing, why she had said nothing, why she had removed the ring and placed it beside his glass with the calm of someone setting down something they no longer needed to carry. She had records. She had always had records. And if she wanted to, she could present those records to every family that had been in that ballroom, to every compact and alliance and ceasefire partner she had shepherded through 9 years of invisible diplomacy. And the story they told would not be the story of a wife abandoned at a public dinner. They would tell the story of what the empire actually was, and who had actually been running it, and what happened when you humiliated the wrong person in front of everyone they had spent 9 years protecting. He had not been standing on solid ground. He had been standing on her. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Luca Crane, his head of internal security, calling from a number Dante didn't recognize. He answered. "I need to tell you something," Luca said. His voice had the particular quality of a man choosing words like a person crossing ice, carefully, with attention to what was under each one. "I should have told you 3 days ago. I didn't, and that's on me, and I'm not asking you to be okay with it." Dante's jaw tightened. "Talk." "I got a message, before the summit, from a contact I've had for 4 years, someone outside the organization. The message told me that something was going to happen at the summit, and that I had a choice about where I stood when it did." The silence that followed had weight in it. "And where did you stand?" Dante said. "I didn't do anything. I didn't warn you, and I didn't help her. I stood still, and I waited to see what happened." Luca paused. "That was the wrong choice. I want you to know I know that." "Who sent the message?" Another pause. "The contact works for someone I've never met directly. Someone who has apparently been running the intelligence side of this organization for a very long time. Not for you." Luca's voice dropped. "I didn't know. I have to think that you have to understand that I didn't know." Dante looked at the report on the table. "Page 11. "Come in," he said. "Tonight." The call ended. He stood in the middle of his apartment in the city that bore the imprint of his name on half its significant transactions, surrounded by the silence of a power structure beginning to understand its own dimensions. And the ring sat on the table, and the report sat on the table. And somewhere in a building 12 blocks from the waterfront, the woman he had discarded in front of 300 witnesses was making calls that would reshape the next 6 months before he had finished processing the last 6 hours. He had one move left that might matter. He picked up his own phone and dialed a number he had not dialed in 4 years. A private investigator he kept at arm's length for situations where he needed information that couldn't touch official channels. The man answered on the first ring, which meant he had been expecting the call, which meant someone had already spoken to him, which meant the walls of Dante's own organization were thinner than he had believed. "Find her," Dante said. "I can't," the investigator said immediately. "I'm not asking. I know you're not asking. I'm telling you." A pause, and in this pause was something Dante hadn't heard directed at him in a very long time. The flat sound of someone who had already made a decision and wasn't afraid to let him hear it. I work for her now. The line went dead. Dante stood holding the phone in a room he owned in a city he controlled and felt, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, the particular and nauseating sensation of being completely alone in a way that had nothing to do with whether other people were present. He had pulled every thread he could reach. Every thread led back to the same hands. And those hands were already 3 moves past the place where anything he did next would make a difference, unless she decided, for reasons entirely her own, to let him catch up. Luca Crane arrived at the tower at 11:43. He came alone, which Dante had not required but noted, because a man who came alone to a meeting like this was either very confident or very finished, and Luca did not look confident. He looked like someone who had been sitting in a car outside his apartment for longer than was comfortable and had finally decided that the cold was preferable to whatever was happening inside his own head. His jacket was wrinkled at the shoulders. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had rehearsed something and then, somewhere between the lobby and the elevator, abandoned the rehearsal entirely. Dante was sitting when Luca came in. He didn't stand. He had the report on the table in front of him, closed now, and a glass of water he hadn't touched, and nothing else. The room was lit from one corner. He'd turned off the overhead lights an hour ago without exactly deciding to. Luca sat down across from him without being invited. "Start from the beginning," Dante said. "Not from the message. From the beginning." Luca folded his hands on the table. His knuckles were dry, the skin cracked slightly along 2 of the joints. The hands of someone who didn't take care of the small things. "4 years ago," he said, "I was running the Eastern Corridor, you know this. The distribution routes through the mountain passes, the pharmaceutical transits, the cold chain logistics. I was having problems with a border checkpoint that wasn't staying bought. I remember. The problem resolved itself. I told you it was because I found the right pressure point on the checkpoint commander. That was true. What I didn't tell you was that the information I used to find the pressure point came from outside. Someone fed me exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it, with no ask attached, no invoice, no favor requested." He paused. "I should have told you. I knew I should have told you. I told myself it was a one-time thing. It wasn't." "No." Luca looked at the table. "Over 4 years, I received 11 separate pieces of intelligence from this contact. 3 of them prevented situations that would have cost us significantly. One of them specifically saved my life. I have believed for 4 years that this contact worked for a competing organization that had a strategic interest in keeping our corridor stable." Dante watched him. "Last month," Luca said, "I received a document, not a message, a full document sent through the same channel. It contained a summary of every piece of intelligence I had ever received from this contact, annotated. The annotations identified the original source for each piece of information." He stopped. His jaw moved once without sound, the swallow of a man pushing something back down. "Every single piece came from inside our own organization, from files and surveillance records and human intelligence that could only have been accessed by someone operating at or above the level of director." The room was very quiet. "And page 11 of that report," Dante said slowly, "tells me who the only person operating at that level actually was." "It wasn't who you trusted," Luca said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. It wasn't Ferris, it wasn't the captains, it wasn't anyone you ever questioned. The access point was someone so embedded in the structure that the structure itself camouflaged her." Dante stood up. He didn't move toward Luca. He moved to the window, which was where he went when he needed the room to be larger than it was. And he stood looking out at the city and felt something moving through his chest that was not quite rage and not quite grief, and was perhaps the specific sensation of 2 things you believed in canceling each other out simultaneously. "She fed you intelligence about my own operation," he said, "to keep you stable, to keep the corridor running. Yes. Without you knowing, it came from her. Yes. For 4 years." Luca said nothing. "And you didn't ask," Dante said. "Not an accusation, just a statement of a fact he was setting down somewhere." "I didn't ask," Luca said. "Because the information was always right. And because when something works, you don't—" He stopped himself. "No, that's an excuse. I didn't ask because I didn't want to know. That's the honest answer." Dante turned from the window. "Get out." Luca stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, which he hadn't taken off, but had somehow accumulated on the furniture anyway. He went to the door. "She's not trying to destroy you," Luca said, his hand on the doorframe. "I don't think that's what this is." "I didn't ask you what you think," Dante said. Luca left. Dante stood alone in the room for 4 minutes. Then he called Ferris and told him to bring in everyone who had been on the approved access list for the encrypted archive beneath the headquarters building. Not for questioning, for a full accounting. He wanted serial numbers on every drive, a log of every file accessed, a timestamp on every entry and exit from the archive room going back 3 years. Ferris said he would have it by morning. Dante said he wanted it by 4 a.m. He didn't sleep. At 2:17 in the morning, the encrypted archive beneath the Valieri headquarters generated an automated alert that Ferris's team had not yet reached and did not see for another 6 hours. The alert was triggered by a remote access attempt. Not a breach, not an intrusion, but a clean authorized login using credentials that had never been revoked because they had never been formally issued, which meant they couldn't be found on any access control list to be revoked. The login lasted 9 minutes. During those 9 minutes, 14 file folders were opened and a directory was copied to an off-site location. The 14 folders all contained the same category of information: the identities, assets, and personal vulnerabilities of Dante's 7 highest-ranking lieutenants. Not for use against them, for protection. Seraphine had copied the files because 26 minutes before the login, she had received a communication that changed the geometry of everything she had been planning. The communication came from a source she had not heard from in 8 months, a woman named Elena Voss, who had no visible connection to any criminal organization and worked on paper as a compliance consultant for a shipping insurance firm in Rotterdam. Elena Voss was also Celine Voss's older sister, which was a connection that did not appear in any database because Celine had not legally existed under that name until 7 years ago. The message from Elena Voss contained 3 sentences and a file attachment. Seraphine read the 3 sentences twice. Then she opened the attachment and read it once, all the way through, without stopping. And when she reached the end, she sat very still for a moment, and then closed the laptop and pressed both hands flat on the desk in front of her, and looked at the far wall and breathed. The attachment was a communication record between 2 parties. One party was unidentified. The messages originated from a rotating encrypted relay that resolved to nothing traceable. The other party was a name Seraphine recognized immediately, a name that appeared in 9 years of her memory as a fixture of the Valieri inner circle, a name she had trusted in the specific limited way she trusted anyone in that world, which was to say, she had trusted it to be what it appeared to be. The name was Oren Voss. Oren Voss had been Dante's senior strategic advisor for 14 years. He was 61 years old, methodical, almost professionally unremarkable, the kind of man whose value was precisely that nobody looked at him twice. He had been at every summit, every negotiation, every significant decision point in the Valieri Syndicate's recent history. He had the access, the institutional memory, and the specific invisibility that made him the perfect instrument for the kind of long-running interior sabotage that left no clean edges. The communication record spanned 31 months. It documented, in the clipped transactional language of 2 people being careful, the engineering of Celine Voss's introduction to Dante Valieri. Not a coincidence, not an affair that happened, an operation that was designed, staffed, and executed with the intention of destabilizing the Valieri Syndicate's leadership structure at its most intimate point. Celine herself, the record made clear in one particularly cold exchange, had been recruited through her financial desperation after a failed business venture and had been told she was participating in a low-risk intelligence gathering arrangement. She had not been told she was the weapon. She had not been told what the endgame was. She had not been told that the communication record contained, in its final pages, a disposal protocol with her name on it. Oren Voss had spent 31 months carefully dismantling the one stabilizing relationship in the Valieri power structure, while maintaining perfect proximity to the man he was dismantling it for. Seraphine read it once, sat still, and then did 6 things in rapid sequence. The first was to copy the archive files. The second was to send a message to Yusuf Tamboli that said only, "Move the Rotterdam contact to Tier 1. The third was to make a call that lasted 40 seconds to a number in Frankfurt that rang 4 times before a man answered with only silence. And into that silence she said 2 names, and the man on the other end said, "Confirmed," and the call ended. The fourth was to write a document on the laptop, brief, precise, formatted like a legal memorandum rather than a letter, and encrypted under a key she had established for exactly this category of contingency. The fifth was to sit with her phone in her hand for a full minute, looking at Dante's name in her contacts, and then put the phone face down on the desk without dialing. The sixth was to stand up, go to the window, and look out at the city that was still dark and still moving in its 4 a.m. way. Delivery trucks, a sweeper running on a side street, the specific orange emptiness of a city at the hour when ordinary people were sleeping and the other kind weren't, and understand that the plan she had built over 4 years and refined over the last 9 days had just encountered a variable she had not included. She had not included Oren Voss because she had not known about Oren Voss. That was the miscalculation. Not a failure of intelligence, a failure of assumption. She had assumed the threat to the syndicate's stability was internal arrogance. She had not assumed it was also an engineered insertion from an outside force using the arrogance as a delivery mechanism. The distinction was significant. It meant that whatever was coming next was not simply the consequence of Dante's personal failures. It was the execution of someone else's plan, and that plan was already in motion, and it was larger than one marriage and one public humiliation and one woman walking out of a ballroom. She sat back down. She opened the laptop. She began to work backward through 31 months of Oren Voss's movements, cross-referencing against every event she had personally navigated that had required more effort than it should have. Every ceasefire that nearly broke, every political contact that went cold without explanation, every route that encountered friction in a year that should have been smooth. She was looking for his fingerprints on the machinery she had spent 9 years maintaining. She was looking for the places where he had introduced sand into the gears, specifically to increase her workload and her exposure, and to ensure that she was always one crisis away from being visible, when visibility was the one thing that would have made her a target. It took her until 6 in the morning. By the time the city began to lighten outside the window, she had identified 11 separate instances across 7 years in which Oren Voss had quietly destabilized a situation she then had to stabilize, never enough to cause a collapse, always precisely calibrated to demand her intervention. He had been using her, not just as collateral damage in a play against Dante. He had been using her problem-solving capacity as a pressure valve to prevent the syndicate from actually imploding before he was ready for it to implode. He knew what she was. He had known for years, and he had counted on her being invisible, counted on Dante's blindness, and the world's general disinterest in the competence of women who didn't seek credit, to ensure she would keep fixing things without ever being in a position to see the full board. She had nearly let him be right. At 7:15 a.m., Dante received the archive access report from Ferris. He read it at his kitchen counter with coffee he didn't taste and eyes that had stopped registering tiredness 6 hours ago. The report listed the 14 accessed folders. It listed the name attached to the off-site copy destination, which was a server address that resolved through 4 layers of misdirection before terminating in a holding company. Ferris had flagged with a single handwritten note in the margin. See incorporation documents, attached. The incorporation documents showed that the holding company had been established in the name of a subsidiary that was itself wholly owned by a parent organization registered under the name Ardenmore Collective. Ferris had circled the name in pen. Below the circle, in his measured handwriting, Arden, her family name. Dante set the report down. He picked up his phone and called Ferris directly. "Who is Oren Voss?" he said, which was not the question Ferris had been expecting, and the silence on the other end lasted long enough for Dante to understand that the question had landed somewhere it needed to land. "Your strategic advisor," Ferris said carefully. "Beyond the title." Dante? "Beyond the title, Ferris." A breath on the other end. "We have been pulling communication records across the organization since yesterday morning. There is a thread in the records that I was going to bring to you this morning in person because it is not the kind of thing that should be said on a phone. Say it on the phone. Oren Voss has been in contact through encrypted relay with a party we have not yet identified for approximately 30 months. The nature of the contact is..." Ferris stopped, reorganized. "It relates to Celine." Dante went completely still. "Her introduction to you was not accidental," Ferris said. "We believe it was arranged. The purpose of the arrangement, based on the communication content we have been able to decrypt thus far, was to create an internal disruption at the leadership level sufficient to, Dante, the phrase used in the most recent recovered communication is render the Valieri Syndicate ungovernable. Dante's hand on the phone was steady. The rest of him was something else entirely. "Where's Voss right now?" he said. "He came in this morning at his normal time. He is in his office. Lock the building. Done. Nobody in or out until I get there." He was in the car in 4 minutes. He drove himself, which he almost never did, because the driver was a variable, and right now he could not manage variables. The city moved past the windows in its morning way: school traffic, delivery schedules, the ordinary machinery of a world that did not know it was sitting on top of a structure that was currently eating itself. And Dante drove with both hands on the wheel and his jaw set and thought about 14 years. 14 years of morning briefings and quarterly reviews and summit preparations and strategic recommendations delivered in the dry, measured voice of a man who appeared to have no stake in anything beyond professional excellence. 14 years of presence so unremarkable it had become invisible, and invisibility in that world, Dante now understood with a clarity that felt like swallowing broken glass, was not the absence of power. It was its most sophisticated form. He arrived at the headquarters building at 8:40. Ferris met him in the lobby. They went up together in silence. Orrin Voss's office was on the 3rd floor, corner position, windows facing the street. I was sitting at his desk when Dante came through the door, and he looked up, and his face did something complicated. Not quite surprise, not quite resignation, something in between that Dante filed away and did not yet assign a name to. Dante closed the door. Ferris stayed outside. "You arranged her," Dante said. "No preamble, no warm-up." "Celine, you arranged her introduction." Voss set down the pen he had been holding. He folded his hands on the desk. He was 61 years old, and he had been in this business longer than Dante had. And whatever he had been expecting when he came in this morning, the question had landed without flinching, and so he answered it without flinching. "Yes," he said. Dante felt the word hit him somewhere below the sternum. He had known it was coming. It hit him anyway. "Why?" Dante said. "Because the syndicate needed restructuring, because you had consolidated too much authority and eliminated too many checks. Because the only person capable of counterbalancing you had been systematically excluded from any formal position of power, and the only way to force a correction was to remove the one thing keeping you from seeing that. You used my marriage. I used the situation your marriage had already become." Voss's voice was level, not defensive, not apologetic, the voice of a man who had made a calculation and was prepared to stand behind the math. "Your wife had been invisible for 9 years. Not because she lacked capability. We both know what she built in that time. Because you preferred her invisible, I accelerated the inevitable. You put a woman in my bed as a weapon. I put an arrangement in front of a woman who needed money and told her it was harmless. That was wrong. The first crack, barely there. That specific part was wrong. I want you to know I'm aware of that." Dante crossed the room in 4 steps and grabbed Voss by the front of his shirt with one hand and pulled him halfway out of the chair, and Voss did not resist, did not raise his hands, just looked at Dante from 6 inches away with the steady eyes of someone who had already made peace with this particular moment arriving. "The Ash Dominion," Dante said. Something shifted in Voss's face. "You know that name," Dante said. Voss said nothing. "You know that name, and you are going to tell me right now what you know, or I will. They were never supposed to move this fast," Voss said quietly, and the sentence detonated in the room like something thrown rather than said. The plan was restructuring, not annihilation. The Dominion was they were a pressure mechanism, coordination tool. They were supposed to create enough external threat to force a voluntary consolidation of power around your wife without... He stopped. His composure, which had been remarkably intact until this moment, developed its first visible fault line. They were not supposed to move independently. Dante released him. He stepped back. "They're moving independently," he said. "I received word this morning," Voss said, "from the relay contact. The Dominion has decoupled from the original agreement. Whatever constraints existed on their operation have been removed. They are not..." He smoothed the front of his shirt with one hand, an automatic gesture, almost absurd given the context. "They are not interested in restructuring the underworld, Dante. They want to inherit the wreckage." Dante stood in the center of the room and felt the architecture of the last 72 hours rearrange itself around this new point. The walkout at the summit, the frozen accounts, and the empty safe houses. His own purge, driving good people towards Seraphine's orbit, all of it, had been the opening movement of something that was not a correction and was not a coup. It was a demolition. And the man who had started it had just told him it was no longer under anyone's control. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He answered because at this point unknown numbers were the only ones likely to tell him anything true. "You need to come to me," Seraphine's voice, flat and steady, and nothing like the voice of a woman who had walked out of a ballroom 5 days ago, the voice of someone who had been working while he had been reacting. "Not because I want you here, because I have something you need to see, and you have approximately 6 hours before the window on this closes permanently." "Where?" Dante said. She gave him an address. He looked at Vas, who was standing by his desk with his hands at his sides, and the expression of a man who had understood, somewhere in the last 4 minutes, that the plan he had set in motion was now a fire he could no longer direct. "Stay in this building," Dante said. "Don't use any communication device. Don't speak to anyone until I return." Vas nodded. Dante walked out. He was in the car and moving before the building door had fully closed behind him, driving toward an address 12 blocks from the waterfront, toward a woman he had publicly discarded 4 days ago, toward a conversation he did not know how to have, and which needed to happen anyway. And behind him the city continued its morning routine with the complete indifference of a world that doesn't adjust its pace for the people burning inside it. His phone rang again. He looked at the screen. "Ferris." He answered. "Two things," Ferris said. "First, the Mariscotti family compound in the Eastern District was breached 40 minutes ago. No casualties, but the family was evacuated. Unknown assailants, military-grade coordination." Dante's grip on the wheel tightened. "Second," Ferris said, and his voice dropped a fraction, the drop of someone delivering something they have not fully processed themselves. "We found a second communication thread in the archive. Not Voss's thread. A different relay, different encryption, running concurrent with his. This one originated inside the building, but the terminal address resolves to a server cluster associated with an organization we have 3 intelligence references to, but no operational profile on." "The Ash Dominion," Dante said. A pause. "Yes," Ferris said. "The second thread has been active for 22 months. It is not Voss's contact. It is someone else in the organization who has been feeding the Dominion direct intelligence about our operations, our assets, and our alliances." Another pause. "Someone with access that would place them no lower than inner circle." Dante drove in silence for a moment. "The Mariscottis were evacuated," he said. "Where did they go?" "Unknown. The evacuation was organized externally. Whoever pulled them out knew exactly where to extract them before our people could respond." Dante turned onto the street with the dry cleaning business on the ground floor. She had evacuated the Mariscottis. She had known the Dominion was moving before his own security apparatus had any indication, and she had already begun pulling people out, and she had still called him. And the reason she had called him was not forgiveness, and was not strategy alone. It was something closer to the recognition that some problems were too large for any single person to manage, even her, and that whatever he had destroyed between them was separate from what was currently threatening to destroy everyone. He parked. He sat in the car for exactly 30 seconds. Then he got out and walked toward the door, and behind him in the Valieri headquarters building, a man named Oren Vas stood at his 3rd-floor window and watched the street below with the expression of someone who had built a clock, wound it fully, and only now understood that he had misread the face and could not reach the hands. And in a building across the city, in an office with no signage, and a door that required a badge that existed in no system, a man whose name appeared nowhere in any communication record associated with the Valieri Syndicate or the Ash Dominion or any organization any investigator had yet thought to look for, closed a laptop and made a call and said 4 words into the phone before the line went silent. The 4 words were, "ahead of schedule." She heard his footsteps in the stairwell before he reached the 4th floor. Not because they were loud, because she had spent 9 years learning the specific weight of that walk. The way he took stairs with his right foot leading slightly, the pause on the 3rd step from the top that he'd had since a knee injury 7 years ago that he'd never fully discussed, and she'd never directly asked about. Small things. The kind of things you accumulate without meaning to and carry without knowing you're carrying them. She was standing at the desk when he came through the door. He looked worse than she had expected, which told her he hadn't slept, which she had assumed but not confirmed. His jacket was the same one from the night before. His eyes had the flat, over-focused quality of someone running on adrenaline past the point where adrenaline is reliable. He looked at the room first, the screens, the desks, the plant on the windowsill, and then at her, and his face did something brief and complicated that he closed down almost immediately. "You evacuated the Mariscades," he said. "Sit down." "I don't need to sit down. You've been awake for 30 hours and your hands are shaking. Sit down, Dante." He sat, not because she told him to, because his body made the decision while his pride was still formulating a refusal. She turned one of the monitors toward him. On the screen was a map, not a geographic map, but a network map. Nodes and connections rendered in blue and red, dozens of points linked by lines of varying thickness. At the center was a cluster of red nodes that pulsed faintly with updated data. "The Ash Dominion," she said. "This is their current operational footprint. The red nodes are active cells, the blue are dormant or unconfirmed." She pointed to a cluster in the northeast quadrant. "This is what moved against the Mariscades this morning. This," she moved her finger to a separate cluster, "is already positioned against the Tamboli Confederation. And this one," a third cluster, larger, closer to the center of the map, "is 48 hours from being in range of every remaining family we have contact with." Dante looked at the map. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is trying to find an error in, because if there's no error, then he has to accept what it's telling him. There was no error. "How long have you had this?" he said. "The framework, 4 years. The current positions, 72 hours. You built an intelligence network on the Dominion." "I built an intelligence network on everyone," she said, which was not a boast. It was a statement of operational fact delivered with the same effect she would have used to explain a weather forecast. "The Dominion became a priority 18 months ago when I identified their first approach to Vaas." Dante's head came up. "You knew about Vaas." "I knew someone was running an external influence operation through someone in your inner circle. I identified Vaas as the likely conduit 8 months ago. I did not know the full scope of his arrangement with the Dominion until 4 days ago." She paused. "Neither did he, as it turns out. He told me they were a pressure mechanism, that he thought he could control them. He was a useful idiot who believed he was a strategist," she said. Not with contempt, with the tired precision of someone who had thought about this for a long time. "The Dominion let him believe that for 30 months because his access and his operation against your marriage served their purpose. When they decided to move independently, they didn't notify him because he was no longer useful." Dante pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes for a moment. "Celine. Her sister contacted me 2 nights ago. The disposal protocol. She found it in a communication record Elena had copied before cutting her own contact with the relay. Celine doesn't know. She's in the city, at the apartment you keep for her, and she has no idea she's been marked." He lowered his hand. "You're going to warn her." "I already did. She didn't believe me." A pause. "She thought it was a tactic." He almost said something, stopped. "The Dominion moves in 48 hours, Seraphine said. Not sequentially, simultaneously. Every major family, every compact alliance, every confederation that was represented at the summit. Coordinated strikes designed to eliminate leadership nodes and create a power vacuum large enough to absorb the entire underworld structure in one operation." She looked at him directly. "Oren Voss did not design this, Dante. He opened a door and something walked through it that was already fully formed on the other side." The room was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" he said. It was, she recognized, the hardest thing he had said in this entire conversation. Maybe in years. She did not acknowledge how hard it was, because acknowledging it would make it about them, and right now it couldn't be about them. "Every resource you still have that hasn't been compromised," she said. "The Eastern Transport Network, if Ferris can verify it's clean. You're standing with the Kowalski family. That's personal. They'll take a call from you. And Luca Crane." "Luca. He's good at what he does and he owes you a correction. Use it." Dante looked at her for a moment. "You're not asking me to take command." "No. You're asking me to be a resource. I'm asking you to be useful, she said, which is different from being in charge. And yes, I understand that distinction costs you something. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded once, pulled out his phone, and called Ferris. The next 6 hours moved with the compressed, sleepless urgency of people operating past the normal tolerances of decision-making. Seraphine's 4th-floor space expanded in function, if not in size. Yusuf Tamboli arrived at noon with 2 of his Confederation's senior logistics people. Carla Vega sent a representative she trusted above everyone except herself. The Kowalski family, reached through Dante's direct line, committed their northern transport corridor and 4 security teams within 20 minutes of the call, which was the fastest Seraphine had ever seen that family move, and she filed that data point away without comment. Luca Crane arrived at 1 p.m. and went directly to the secondary desk without speaking to anyone, opened a laptop, and began the work of identifying which of the Dominion's red nodes had exploitable vulnerabilities in their communication infrastructure. He did not look at Dante. Dante did not look at him. They were 2 people who had a reckoning scheduled for a later date and were mutually, efficiently postponing it. Celine Voss was extracted from the city apartment at 2:17 p.m. by a 2-person team that Seraphine had dispatched without informing Dante until after the fact. She told him when he noticed the team's movement in the logistics log. He looked at the log entry, looked at her. She would have been killed tonight, Seraphine said. I know. I didn't do it for you. I know that too, he said, and went back to his phone. The first strike came at 4:44 p.m., 9 hours ahead of the Dominion's projected timeline. It hit the Delacroix family's primary safe house in the Port District, not the one on the official registry, the secondary one that existed in no document except a handwritten note in the late Patriarch Delacroix's personal files, which meant the Dominion had human intelligence inside the family going back at least a decade. The strike was fast, professional, and designed to leave survivors who would flee and create traffic on communication channels, which was a technique for mapping network connections by watching who called whom in the first 20 minutes after a catastrophic event. Seraphine saw it for what it was immediately. Don't let anyone call out, she said sharply, and Luca relayed the order across 6 simultaneous channels while she was still speaking. They're not trying to kill everyone. They're harvesting contact data. Lock every family channel for the next 30 minutes. No outgoing, nothing. The families will panic, Yusuf said. The families will be alive to panic, she said. Do it. It was done. The Dominion's data harvesting operation produced nothing because the channels went dark 14 seconds after the strike, which was fast enough to give them only a partial map. Enough to work from, but not enough to be comprehensive. Seraphine watched the timing on the network monitor and understood they had bought themselves perhaps 4 hours of operational confusion before the Dominion recalibrated. 4 hours was enough if they moved now. Dante, she said. He was already at her shoulder. The Dominion has 3 command and control nodes, she said, pointing to the map. This one directs the Western operation. This one handles communications. This one, she touched the largest red cluster, is command. All 3 are here. She pulled a secondary map. Geographic this time, coastal. A former industrial district, half reclaimed, with a large structure at its center that had been, 15 years ago, a weapons depot and had subsequently been converted into a private event facility, currently listed as unoccupied pending renovation. They're operating out of a converted event space, Dante said. The renovation was a cover. They've been inside for at least 4 months. She pulled up a structural overlay. The main hall is here. Based on the communication signal density, command is operating from the lower level, which means underground access, Dante said immediately. There's a rail tunnel that runs beneath the district, decommissioned. It connects to the main structure's lower level through a utility conduit. It hasn't been used in 11 years, which means it's not guarded because it's not on any operational map. Because it's not on any operational map, Dante said slowly, except yours. She looked at him without answering that. How did you get the structural overlay? He said. I had it commissioned 2 years ago. He stopped. You had it commissioned 2 years ago. I had structural overlays commissioned for 47 facilities across 9 countries that I considered potential operational risks, she said. This one was flagged 14 months ago when I identified anomalous utility consumption in the district. She paused, brief. I knew something was in there. I didn't know what until 4 days ago. Dante was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room was moving. Voices, keyboards, the controlled urgency of people who understood what was at stake and were managing their fear by converting it into work. "Who goes in?" Dante said. "Luca takes the eastern approach with 6 of your people. Tamboli's logistics team covers the rail entry. I coordinate from here." She paused. "You take the southern perimeter. You know those captains, and they'll hold tighter under your direct command than under a relay. And the command level." She didn't answer immediately. "Seraphine, who goes into command?" "I do," she said, "with 2 people I trust." He turned to face her fully. It's not a discussion," she said. "I have the structural map and I know the communication architecture. Nobody else in this room has both. I go." He held her gaze. His jaw was tight. Something moved behind his eyes that was complicated and old and not resolvable in this moment, or possibly any moment soon. "Then I'm going with you," he said. "You're needed on the southern. Ferris runs the southern perimeter. He's capable." He said it with the flatness of a decision already made. "I'm going with you." She looked at him for 3 seconds. "You follow my lead. No independent action without my call." "Understood." "I mean it, Dante. Not as a gesture, not as agreement for the sake of moving forward. You follow my lead, or you stay here." "I follow your lead," he said. And she heard, in the way he said it, that he meant it. Not easily, not without cost, but genuinely. It was the first genuinely small thing he had offered her without it being shaped around his own need, and she noted it and moved on because there wasn't time for anything else. They went in at 6 p.m. The rail tunnel was cold and smelled of old water and oxidized metal, the walls sweating with the specific damp of underground spaces that haven't been ventilated in years. Seraphine moved with a flashlight held low, her other hand on the structural map she'd printed and folded into a pocket. Dante was 2 steps behind her, 2 people she trusted. A woman named Roz, who had worked logistics for the Ardmore network for 3 years, and a man named Kyle, who had been a structural engineer before other circumstances, completed the team. The tunnel ran for 400 meters before it met the utility conduit. Seraphine had anticipated the conduit access being sealed. It was, but with a panel rather than a welded closure, which meant someone had gone through it recently enough to want to be able to go through it again. Kale had the panel open in 40 seconds. Beyond it, a corridor, concrete, lit with temporary fluorescent strips mounted at intervals. The hum of climate control equipment somewhere below. They moved through the corridor in silence. Seraphine counted doors. 3rd on the left, according to the structural overlay. She stopped at the door, pressed her hand flat against it, felt the faint vibration of equipment beyond it. She looked at Dante. He nodded. She opened the door. The lower command space was larger than the structural overlay had suggested. The overlay had been generated from external utility readings and was accurate about the location, but had underestimated the interior modification. What had been a utility storage level had been stripped and rebuilt. Server banks along the north wall, a central table covered in monitors, communication equipment running along 2 additional walls. There were 6 people in the room. 4 of them were technical operators, young, focused, the kind of people who were dangerous for their expertise rather than their aggression. The other 2 were something else. One of them, Seraphine recognized from a photograph Elena Voss had included in the original communication record. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, a gray-haired administrator type, the kind of face that would not draw attention at a hotel breakfast. His name, according to the record, was Barrett Ono, and he was the Ash Dominion's operational director for the regional campaign. The other one was not in any photographs Seraphine had. The other one was Oren Voss. She stopped moving. Dante, 2 steps behind her, felt her stop and stopped immediately, reading it as a tactical signal, and then he looked past her shoulder and saw Voss standing at the central table with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the expression on Voss's face when he saw them was not the expression of a man who had been caught. It was the expression of a man who had been expecting them. "I told them you'd find the tunnel," Voss said. His voice was the same as it had always been, measured, almost pleasant. Barrett didn't believe me. Seraphine's mind was already moving. He'd left the headquarters building. Dante had told him to stay. He had used the time between Dante's departure and Ferris discovering his absence to reach the command node, which meant he had a route they hadn't mapped. and a standing arrangement with the Dominion that was more current than the disposal record suggested. Or the disposal record was fabricated. The communication record, she said. Vyas smiled slightly. Elena Voss is not Celine's sister. She is a Dominion asset who has been feeding you what we needed you to have in order to bring you here, at this time, with the resources you moved into position today. He looked at her with something that might, in a different context, have been respect. Your counter-mapping of our network was remarkable. You identified 73% of our real nodes. The remaining 27% are positioned precisely around the locations where your resource deployment created gaps. The room had gone very still. Seraphine did not move, did not look at Dante. She was thinking at a speed that had a physical sensation to it, something behind her eyes and in the back of her throat, running through everything she had done in the last 72 hours and recontextualizing it against what Vyas had just said. The evacuation deployments, the Kowalski corridor commitment, Luca's infrastructure mapping, which had required accessing specific network nodes that she had now just been told were deliberate exposures. She had moved her people into the gaps. The families we evacuated, she said, are currently in locations that our teams are in the process of reaching, Vyas said. He was not gloating. He was reporting. The evacuation concentrated them, made them easier to manage collectively. A pause. Seraphine, you built something extraordinary. For 9 years you held together something that should have collapsed under its own contradictions. That is not nothing. But you built it in service of a structure that was already terminal. The syndicate model is finished. What comes next requires consolidation, not preservation. Consolidation, she said. One authority, one decision structure. No competing families, no blood feuds held in temporary suspension by fragile agreements. A clean architecture. He looked at her steadily. We wanted you to lead it. That offer is still available. And everyone I evacuated, she said, Mariscotti, Tomboli, Vega, would have roles in the new structure, he said. Reduced roles, supervised roles. But they would be alive. And if I decline? Ono, who had not spoken, moved slightly. Not toward her, just a shift of weight. The specific body language of someone indicating without words that options are narrowing. Dante moved faster than anyone in the room anticipated. He crossed the space between himself and Ono in 3 steps and had the man's arm behind his back before Ono had fully registered that something was happening. And the sound Ono made when his shoulder joint reached its limit was not a sound that required description. And Dante held him there with his breathing hard and his eyes on Vyas and said, with a quietness that was somehow worse than volume, call them off. Whatever is moving toward the evacuation sites, call it off right now. Vyas looked at him, looked at Seraphine. Dante, Vyas began. Dante increased the pressure. Ono made the sound again, shorter this time. One of the technical operators stood up and then stopped standing up when Roz moved into his peripheral vision. She's not going to lead your structure, Dante said, and neither am I. And you're going to call off the operation, or I'm going to work my way through every person in this room until someone picks up a phone and does it for me. Voss looked at Seraphine. Is this your lead? She looked at Dante. At his hands, which were shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from 30-some hours of deprivation and adrenaline and something he was holding back that was much older than tonight. At the way he was standing with his weight slightly wrong, favoring the knee he'd never had properly treated. At the flatness in his eyes that was not cruelty, but a decision. Then she looked at Voss. No, she said. This isn't. She stepped forward past Dante until she was standing at the central table with its monitors and its server feeds and its real-time map of an operation moving against people she had spent 9 years protecting. She put both hands on the table and leaned forward and looked at the face of a man who had been running this for 30 months and believed he had understood her completely. Here is what you got wrong, she said. You assumed that because I spent 9 years working without credit, I was working for recognition. I wasn't. I was working because the alternative was watching something I had built collapse because the person standing on it couldn't see the floor. She straightened. That's done. The syndicate structure I was maintaining is over, and you're right about that. But the families I evacuated are not assets in your consolidation. They are people who trusted me to keep them safe, and the price of that trust is non-negotiable. She reached into her jacket and placed a drive on the table. Small, black, unremarkable. That drive contains the complete architectural documentation of your network, she said. All of it, not 73%. Every node, every asset, every operational account, every communication relay, every name. She looked at him steadily. I built my mapping from the inside. Not from your external signals. From Luca's infrastructure access 4 years ago, which fed me your initial build-out before you finished it. I have been current on your full network for 31 months. The room was completely silent. You can call off the operation and we negotiate what comes next, she said. Or I transmit that file to every law enforcement and intelligence agency that has been wanting a reason to act against organized crime for the last decade, and the only thing the Ash Dominion consolidates is prison time. Vyas looked at the drive, looked at her. For the first time since they had entered the room, his composure showed something beneath it. Not fear, exactly, but the specific deflation of a man who has run a very sophisticated play and arrived at the final move to discover the board has been different from what he was seeing the entire time. You've had the full map, he said. Since month 4 of your build-out, she said. I've been watching you work and waiting to see whether you'd stop before you made yourself necessary to remove. And we didn't stop. No, she said. You didn't. Voss looked at the drive for a long moment. Then he looked at Ono, still held by Dante, still making the careful, controlled breathing of someone whose shoulder was at its limit. He looked at the 4 technical operators, who were young and had not signed up for this specific version of events. He picked up the phone on the central table. He dialed. He said 3 words into it, a code. She recognized its structure even if she didn't know the specific sequence, and then set the phone down and looked at her and said quietly, "The operation is suspended." She looked at the network map on the monitors. The red nodes were stilling. One by one, the pulsing that indicated active movement went to standby. Dante released Ono, who folded slightly and grabbed the table edge with his good arm. Seraphine picked up the drive. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. It was Yusuf Tamboli. She answered. The team that was moving on the eastern site has stopped, Yusuf said. She could hear the confusion in his voice, the compressed relief of someone who had been watching something terrible approach, and then watched it halt. What happened? A negotiation, she said. Are you? I'm fine. Hold your position. I'll reach you in 20 minutes. She ended the call. She looked at the room, at the server bank still running, at the monitors showing a suspended operation, at Vyas, who was standing with his arms at his sides and the look of a man who had reached the end of something very long and was not yet sure what came after. At Dante, who was standing 3 feet to her right with his knuckles split where they'd connected with the side of the table when he'd moved on Onno, blood on his fingers, his breathing still elevated, his eyes on her. The building groaned above them. Then a sound came from the corridor, not from the direction they had entered, from the direction deeper in the structure, through a door on the far side of the command space that the structural overlay had identified as a secondary emergency exit, but which was now, according to the handle, moving from the other side, not an exit. It was an entrance. Kale moved toward it. Roz moved toward it. Seraphine raised one hand to stop them both. The door opened. What came through it was not a Dominion operator and was not law enforcement and was not anything she had accounted for, and in the half-second before she understood what she was seeing, the entire geometry of the night shifted one final time. The door opened all the way, and Celine Voss walked through it. She was not dressed for an operation. She was wearing the clothes she'd had on when the extraction team picked her up from the city apartment. Dark jeans, a cream-colored blouse now wrinkled from hours of sitting, somewhere waiting, her hair pulled back in a way that looked like it had started as something deliberate and become something else over the course of a long and frightening day. She had a bruise forming along her left cheekbone. Her eyes were moving fast across the room. The servers, the monitors, Onno holding his shoulder, Vyas standing with his arms at his sides, Dante with blood on his knuckles. And then they landed on Seraphine and stopped. The extraction team, Seraphine said, not a question. Locked me in a room, Celine said. In a building 3 blocks from here. There was a ventilation access in the ceiling. She touched the bruise on her cheek without seeming to notice she was doing it. I didn't know where else to go. I followed the tunnel markers on the outside of the conduit. Someone had scratched arrows into the concrete. Kale made a small sound that might have been guilt. He had marked the conduit entry for the return route and had not anticipated this particular use of that information. Celine looked at Vyas. "You were going to have me killed," she said. It was not a question either. Her voice was flat in the specific way of someone who has spent several hours in a locked room, arriving at a conclusion they didn't want to reach and have now reached completely. Vyas looked at her for a moment. "The operation required. I know what the operation required." Her voice didn't crack. It stayed flat and it stayed level, and it was somehow worse for that. "I want to hear you say it." Vyas said nothing. "Say it," she said. "Yes," Vyas said quietly. "You were in the disposal protocol." The word disposal landed in the room, and nobody touched it. Celine nodded once, the nod of a woman filing something away in a place that will hurt to access later, but is survivable now if you don't look directly at it. She looked at Seraphine. "You tried to warn me." "Yes." "I thought it was a play, to get me to run." She swallowed. "I've been used as a play before." "I know," Seraphine said. Something passed between them in that moment. Not forgiveness, nothing as tidy as that, but recognition. The specific recognition of two women who had both been positioned inside the same man's blind spots and had navigated that fact differently and arrived at the same burning room. It lasted 2 seconds, and then both of them looked away because there was still too much unfinished in the room to allow for anything that took longer than 2 seconds. Seraphine looked at Vyas. "The technical operators," she said. "They're done. Let them go." Vyas looked at her. "They're not the architects of this," she said. "They're people who took a job. Let them go, or I have a different conversation with you about what this negotiation looks like going forward." Vyas looked at the 4 people at the server stations, all of whom had been very carefully not making eye contact with anyone for the last several minutes. "Go," he said. They went, quickly. The door to the corridor closed behind the last of them, and the sound of their footsteps on the concrete diminished and disappeared, and the room held its remaining occupants in the particular silence of people who know the reckoning is close now and cannot be postponed further. "The network documentation on that drive," Vyas said. "Is it real?" "Yes," Seraphine said. "All of it. All of it." He studied her for a moment. "Then you had the capacity to dismantle us at any point in the last 31 months. "Yes." "And you didn't." "I was watching to see whether the Dominion was a symptom or a disease," she said. "If it was a symptom, if it was a response to a genuine structural failure in how the underworld operated, then dismantling it without addressing the structural failure would just produce a different version of the same problem in 2 years. I needed to understand the root before I treated it." She paused. "And I needed to know whether the people inside it were reachable or whether they were committed to annihilation regardless of whether their goals could be achieved some other way." "And your conclusion?" Vyas said. "Mixed," she said. "You're reachable. Ono, I'm less certain about." She glanced at Ono, who was sitting now, still holding his shoulder, his face the face of a man who understood his position in this conversation had become significantly less than it had been an hour ago. "The Dominion's financial infrastructure, the communication network, the operational capacity you've built over 4 years, that doesn't have to be burned. It can be repurposed, under different governance." Vyas was quiet for a moment. "You're proposing to absorb us." "I'm proposing that the thing you wanted, a consolidated authority, a clean structure, no more perpetual blood feuds, is achievable, just not through elimination, through covenant." She looked at him steadily. "The families I evacuated, the compacts and confederations, they will not accept being ruled. They will accept being governed. There's a difference, and if you can't see it, then we have no further conversation." Vyas looked at the drive on the table, looked at the monitors, where the suspended operation sat in standby, dozens of red nodes pulsed to quiet. Looked at Dante, who had not spoken since releasing Ono, and who was standing with his back against the server rack, and his arms loose at his sides and his eyes on Seraphine, and whose face had been doing something throughout this conversation that was not anger and was not pride and was not any of the things his face usually did, something quieter and harder to name than any of those. "What happens to me?" Vyas said. "That depends on what you do next," Seraphine said. "Tonight, you help us close down the active cells cleanly. No casualties, no panicked operators making independent decisions with weapons in their hands. After tonight, You sit across a table from me and every family head I can convene, and you explain, with complete documentation, the full scope of the Dominion's operational reach. After that, we determine what role exists for someone with your capabilities in a structure that operates on accountability rather than concealment. She paused. It won't be what you imagined for yourself, but it will be real, and it will be stable, and nobody will put you in a disposal protocol. Voss looked at her for a long time. You thought about this before tonight, he said. I've been thinking about what comes after for 4 years, she said. You were always one of the scenarios. He exhaled. Not dramatically. Just the slow release of a man who has been holding a very large thing for a very long time and is setting it down. He reached across the central table and picked up the operational command handset and began to make calls. And the room listened to him give closed-down orders in the clipped, coded language of a command structure being methodically disassembled. And with each call, another cluster of red nodes on the monitor shifted from standby to dark. It took 47 minutes. By the time the last node went dark, it was 8:13 in the evening, and outside the converted facility, the city was moving into its night configuration. Restaurants opening, lights coming on in windows, the ordinary world pursuing its ordinary business with no knowledge of what had been suspended 47 minutes earlier in a basement it would never know existed. Seraphine called Yusuf first, then Carla Vega's representative, then Luca, who was still at the 4th floor space with half his operation running, and she told him to stand the teams down and start the documentation process. And he said, "Is it over?" And she said, "This part." And he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Understood," and ended the call. She looked at Dante. He was still against the server rack. The blood on his knuckles had dried. He had not moved much in the last 47 minutes, had stood and watched and let it complete without inserting himself into it, which was a thing she had not been fully confident he was capable of, and which he had managed, imperfectly, but genuinely, because she had asked him to. "We need to get Ono to somewhere secure," she said, "and we need Voss in a documented location before morning." "Ferris can arrange both," Dante said. His voice was rougher than usual. The long night was fully in it now. She nodded. She started moving toward the corridor. He fell into step beside her, and Celine came behind them, and Rose and Kale covered the rear, and they walked back through the concrete passage with the flashlight held low and the smell of old water around them, and nobody spoke. In the tunnel, halfway back, Dante said quietly, "The second source. The one feeding the Dominion direct intelligence from inside the building for 22 months. Ferris said it was someone at inner circle level." A pause. "It wasn't Voss. He didn't know who it was either." Seraphine kept walking. "It was me," she said. He stopped. She took 3 more steps and then stopped as well, not turning around. The flashlight beam moved slightly in her hand and the tunnel walls moved with it, the old concrete rippling with shadow. "I fed them controlled intelligence for 22 months, she said. Not operational data. Nothing that got anyone hurt. Structural information that let them believe they had a source while giving me a direct window into how they processed and prioritized intelligence. Every piece I fed them told me something about how they thought, what they valued, where their blind spots were." She paused. "The source they believed in was the fiction I maintained. When they acted on information I provided, I could predict the action." Dante was silent for a long moment. "You were running both sides," he said. "I was managing a threat that nobody else knew existed," she said, "by the only method available to someone operating without official authority or organizational backing or anyone who knew what she was doing." She started walking again. He stood in the tunnel for 2 more seconds. Then he followed. They came out of the conduit and through the tunnel exit into the night air, which hit cold and clean after the underground damp, and all of them took a breath that was more than just oxygen, the specific breath of people who have been inside something compressed and have come out the other side into space. Celine stood on the cracked pavement and looked up at the sky, which was clear, the first stars becoming visible at the edges where the city light thinned. She stood like that for a moment with her arms at her sides and her face tilted up and her eyes open. "What happens to me?" she said. Seraphine looked at her. "What do you want?" Celine lowered her head and looked at her directly. It was the first time she had done that, fully, without the performance that had been the operating mode of her entire presence in Dante's world. Without the carefully managed impression. Just a woman in a wrinkled blouse with a bruise on her cheekbone looking at another woman and asking and being asked in the same breath. I want to not be in this world anymore, Celine said. I never wanted to be in it. I wanted money and I was desperate and someone told me it was simple. She stopped. Nothing about it was simple. No, Seraphine said. It never is. She made a call. Brief. 3 sentences. When she ended it, she looked at Celine. There are people who arrange new identities and clean relocation for individuals whose previous circumstances put them at continued risk. It's not romantic. It's a small apartment somewhere ordinary, and a name you'll need to practice and a job you'll need to show up for. She paused. But nobody knows where you are, and nobody is looking. Celine looked at her for a long moment. Why would you do that for me? Because you were a tool someone else picked up, Seraphine said. And because I have the capacity to, and that's enough of a reason. A car arrived at the end of the block, not the kind of car that announced itself. Ordinary make, ordinary color, 2 people in the front who did not look like anything in particular. Celine looked at it, looked at Seraphine, looked, finally, briefly, at Dante, who was standing to the side with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the middle distance. She didn't say anything to him. He didn't say anything to her. There was nothing between them that required language anymore. Whatever it had been completed and was now only the residue of something that had served another person's purpose and was finished. Celine walked to the car and got in, and the door closed and the car pulled away, and the 3 of them watched it go until it turned a corner and its taillights disappeared. Then Dante said, Oren Voss manipulated me for 30 months, and I never saw it. No, Seraphine said. Because I was too busy believing I was the architect. She didn't respond to that. You knew the whole structure was being undermined, he said. You knew for years. You kept it running anyway. I kept it running because there were people inside it who didn't deserve to pay for its failures, she said. Not for you. I want to be clear about that. I know. He turned to look at her, fully. His face in the night air was tired in the way that went past physical tiredness. The exhaustion of a man who has run a very long race and arrived at the finish line to discover the finish line was somewhere he had never meant to end up. I owe you things I don't have words for yet, he said. Not an apology. Apologies are for mistakes. What I did was more than a mistake, and I don't have the right vocabulary for it yet. Maybe I'll find it. Maybe I won't. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was something more complicated than forgiveness. The acknowledgement of a man who was, for perhaps the first time she had witnessed it, in genuine reckoning with himself without an audience in mind. What happens now? He said. Now, she said. We do the very long work. The next 3 months were the hardest work Seraphine had ever done, which was a significant statement given the 9 years that had preceded them. The convening took 2 weeks to arrange and required individual conversations with 11 family heads, 4 Confederation leaders, and 7 independent operators who had no formal alliance with anyone and whose participation was voluntary and therefore fragile. Seraphine conducted most of those conversations herself, in person, in the kind of unremarkable locations, mid-range hotel meeting rooms, private dining spaces, the back offices of legitimate businesses, that announced nothing to anyone watching. She traveled with 2 people. She slept in 4-hour intervals and ate whatever was available and did not, in those 3 months, spend a consecutive week in any single city. Dante was part of some of those conversations. Not all. She chose the ones where his presence added something specific, where his relationship with a particular family head provided a foundation she could build on rather than a complication she had to navigate around. When she excluded him from a meeting, she told him why, and he accepted the reasoning without argument, which was itself a form of adjustment that she noted without commenting on because commenting on it would have made it a performance. He had dismantled the Valieri Syndicate's unilateral command structure in the second week, which he did by calling together his senior people and telling them, without ceremony, that the model was finished and the succession of assets would follow a distribution he had outlined in a document he handed to Ferris to administer. It was not a dramatic moment. He had not made it dramatic, which Seraphine thought was, possibly, the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. The first formal session of what Seraphine called the High Compact took place in a building in a port city that had no particular history with any of the families involved, chosen deliberately for its neutrality. 14 representatives. An agenda that Seraphine had written and distributed 3 days in advance, and which contained at its end a covenant of conduct. Not a legal document, nothing that would survive outside the room it was signed in, but a specific and detailed agreement about how disputes would be resolved, how shared resources would be managed, how new members could be admitted, and how existing members could be removed. She ran the session. Not from a head chair. She had deliberately removed the head position from the table configuration. She ran it from wherever she was standing or sitting, which changed, and the conversation organized itself around her movement without her calling attention to that fact. Mariscotti ratified the covenant first. He signed with the careful deliberateness of a man whose hand was less steady than it used to be, and he said nothing when he was done, and the room watched him in the specific silence of people understanding that something was being witnessed. Carla Vega signed second, Yusuf Tamboli third. By the time the 8th signature was on the document, the remaining 6 representatives had stopped deliberating and were simply waiting for their turn. Dante signed last. He was not asked to sign last. He chose to. He sat in his place at the non-hierarchical table and waited while every other name went on the document, and when it came to him he looked at it for a moment, at the 11 names above his, at the covenant text above those, at the 3 pages of specific and unromantic language describing how power would work differently now, and he signed his name in the bottom right position and set the pen down and did not make a speech. Seraphine watched him from across the table. He looked up and found her eyes. She held his gaze for a moment, just a moment. Then she looked at the room and said, "We'll take a 15-minute break and then address the operational transition schedule for the Eastern Corridor." People stood, moved, reached for water glasses, began the low-level conversational movement of a meeting pausing, the ordinary human texture of a gathering of people doing difficult work. Luca Crane, who had been given a defined and documented role in the compact's security oversight structure, was standing near the door when Dante passed him. They stopped. They looked at each other. Luca said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Dante listened, nodded once, moved on. The reckoning between them was not finished. It would take longer than a nod, longer than a month. But it was begun, and begun was something. Oren Voss had spent 6 weeks in a secure facility providing the complete documentation Seraphine had required. The process had been supervised by a 3-person oversight group she had appointed from representatives who had no prior relationship with Voss. The documentation was thorough. The debriefing was thorough. At the end of it, Seraphine had met with him once, alone, in a room with no recording equipment. She had checked herself and told him she had checked, which was a form of honesty she extended even to people she didn't entirely trust. She had asked him one question that was not logistical. "Did you believe," she said, "at any point in 30 months, that what you were doing was going to produce something better than what existed?" He had thought about it for long enough that she believed the answer was genuine. "Yes," he said, "in the beginning. By the end, I was mostly trying to control a process I had started and couldn't stop." He paused. The distance between those two things is where most disasters live. She had considered that. "You'll have a role," she had told him, "supervised, documented, with no independent operational authority." She paused. "And if you run another concealed operation of any kind, you know what I have." "The drive," he said. "The drive," she said. He had understood. He had accepted. He was not happy about it, which she considered appropriate. Ono was a different case. Ono, it emerged through the debriefing process, had known about the disposal protocol for Celine from the beginning and had added her name to it himself, on the grounds that she was an operational liability. There was no negotiation available for that. He was transferred to a law enforcement contact in a jurisdiction where the compact had no influence and no interest in providing insulation. And what happened after that was not Seraphine's responsibility, and she did not follow it. Ferris remained with what was left of the Volieri administrative structure, which became, in the transition, the administrative backbone of the compact's Eastern Secretariat. He was good at organization and bad at sentiment, which made him ideal for a process that required the first and could not afford the second. He sent Seraphine a 2-line message the day the Secretariat was officially constituted. The message said, "I missed the shape of it. I won't again." She read it and did not reply because she didn't need to, and he would have known a reply wasn't required. Celine sent one message, 4 months after the car had turned the corner. It came through a relay and had no return address. It said, "The job is boring, and the apartment is smaller than I prefer, and I have never slept this well in my adult life." Seraphine read it twice and then deleted it and sat for a moment in the fourth-floor space that was becoming gradually less of an operational hub and more of a working office. The screen still there, but not all running. The couch still there. The plant on the windowsill that had been watered by someone every week through everything. Its leaves an unremarkable and persistent green. She thought about the ring. She had not retrieved it from the ballroom table. She had not gone back to the Belladonna estate, had no desire to. Whether it was still there, or had been collected by the estate staff, or had found its way to some collection of lost property. Somewhere was not something she had investigated. The indentation on her finger had faded by the end of the first month. The skin was the same color all the way across now. She had not put anything else on the finger. She had not decided whether she would. The second session of the High Compact was held 2 months after the first, in a different city, with the same 14 representatives and 3 new observers admitted on provisional terms. Seraphine presented the transition progress report herself, standing, without notes, for 40 minutes. The room was quiet throughout in the way rooms are when the person speaking is saying things the listeners need to hear and already know are true. When she finished, Mariscotti said from his seat near the east window, "The Belladonna Summit. Every year. My family has attended for 40 years. Will we continue?" Seraphine had thought about this. "Yes," she said. "But the format will change. The summit exists to create alignment. The alignment now has a structure. So the summit becomes a review, not an announcement. Every family presents to the room, not to a head seat." She paused. "And the seating arrangement will be circular." Nobody argued with that. At the end of the session, as people were gathering jackets and cases, and the low-level movement of a meeting ending replaced the focused stillness of a meeting in progress, Dante came to stand near her. Not beside her, nearby, with the specific care of a man who had learned through some combination of observation and failure the difference between proximity and presumption. "The next summit," he said, "the Belladonna. Are you going back there?" "Yes," she said. "It'll be different." "Most things are," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Around them the room was clearing, the ordinary human traffic of people with places to go. "I've been looking for the word," he said. "The right one. For what I owe you that I told you I didn't have language for yet." She looked at him. "I think it might not be one word," he said. "I think it might be a long time of being different than I was, and not asking you to notice." He paused, "and not asking you for anything." She studied his face. The tiredness was still in it, a permanent residue now, the kind that settled into the lines around a person's eyes after a sustained encounter with their own failures and didn't fully leave. But there was something else in it too, something that had not been there at the summit, in the ballroom, in any of the years before. The specific look of a man who has stopped performing strength and is simply sitting with his own dimensions, whatever they are. "I know," she said. It was the same 2 words she had given him in the tunnel, but they meant something slightly different now, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything more about it because more would have been too many words for a thing that was only beginning and needed room to be whatever it was going to be without being named prematurely. The room was nearly empty. Yusuf passed them on his way to the door and gave Seraphine a look that contained approximately 11 things, most of them affectionate, and one of them a question she would answer some other time. She gave him a look back that answered the main question, which was, she was fine, and fine was enough for right now. Dante left before her. He went through the door with his jacket folded over one arm and his phone in his hand already, the man with things to do, but moving differently than he used to, less like a person clearing a path and more like a person navigating one. The door closed behind him. Seraphine stood in the room for another minute. Outside the window, the port city was doing what port cities do, loading, unloading, the endless tidal movement of cargo and people between one place and another. Ships moved in the middle distance. Cranes swung in their slow arcs. The particular gray-blue light of an autumn afternoon on the water came through the glass and fell across the empty chairs, the circular table, the document in the center of it with 14 names on it, The specific and unremarkable paper artifact of a thing that had taken 9 years and a great deal of damage to make possible. She picked up the covenant document, folded it once, put it in her bag. She went to the window and stood there for a moment with her hand flat against the glass, the cold of it coming through her palm, looking at the water and the ships and the ordinary working world that continued regardless of what happened in the rooms above it. The underworld it floated on was quieter than it had been. Not quiet, never fully quiet, but quieter. And the quiet was the kind that came from structure rather than fear, which was a different quality of quiet entirely, and one she had spent a long time working toward. She was tired, not the operational tiredness of the last months, something older, deeper, the tiredness of a person who has carried something very heavy across a very long distance and has finally, tentatively, set it somewhere solid and is allowing their body to register what that effort cost. She would rest. She would begin the next thing. She picked up her bag and walked toward the door, and the room behind her held its empty chairs and its gray-blue light and the ghost of the conversation that had happened in it, and the door swung shut, and she walked down the corridor and out into the afternoon. The air smelled of salt and diesel and autumn. She breathed it in, kept walking. Months became a season, and the season became something closer to ordinary. The High Compact's third session convened at the Belladonna Estate in late autumn, the first time the estate had hosted a formal gathering since the night Seraphine had walked out of its ballroom. She arrived 30 minutes before anyone else, not because the schedule required it, but because she wanted the first minutes in that space to belong to herself alone. The ballroom looked the same. The chandeliers were the same. The long windows facing the courtyard were the same, the cobblestones beyond them wet from recent rain, the iron lanterns swinging slightly in a wind that came off the water with the specific cold of a season turning final. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the head table, now pushed against the far wall, no longer a head table, just a surface for water pitchers and printed agendas, and felt the room's memory of that night without being consumed by it. She had been here. She had removed a ring. She had walked through those doors. Everything that followed had followed from that. She was not sorry for any of it. The room filled the way rooms fill when people arrive who carry weight. Not loudly, but with a particular density, the air-changing quality as each person entered. Mariscotti came in on his nephew Rinaldo's arm, the knee worse than last year, but the man himself somehow more present, as if the reduction of physical mobility had redistributed his authority entirely into his attention. He found Seraphine across the room immediately, and held her gaze for a moment and nodded once, which from Aldo Mariscotti was equivalent to a standing ovation. Carla Vega arrived with two of her own people and the expression of a woman who was perpetually unimpressed by ceremony and perpetually committed to showing up for it anyway. She clasped Seraphine's hand when she reached her, briefly, firmly, and said, "The Eastern Corridor Transition Report. I have notes." And Seraphine said, "I expected nothing less." And Carla almost smiled. Yusuf Tamboli came in talking on his phone, finished the call before he crossed the threshold, pocketed the device, and greeted Seraphine with the specific warmth of a man who had been in a tunnel under a weapons depot with her, and considered that a reasonable basis for friendship. The circular table was arranged in the center of the ballroom, 14 chairs, no head position. Each place had a copy of the agenda, a glass, a small card printed with the room's covenant reminder. Not the full document, just 3 lines distilled from it. The 3 lines had been Seraphine's idea. She had written them herself 3 times, before she had the language exactly right. Dante arrived last. Not because he was late, he was precisely on time. He came through the ballroom doors at the exact minute the session was scheduled to begin, and the room was already full, and he walked to his chair. No particular chair, any chair. He had chosen the one that placed him directly across the circular table from the door, rather than near it, and sat down without ceremony. He looked at Seraphine. She looked at him. The table between them was round, which meant there was no across in any hierarchical sense. They were simply 2 points on a circle, equidistant from the center, equidistant from every other point. That was the design. That was the point. She opened the session. It ran for 3 hours. There were disputes, real ones, the kind that required the specific skill of holding 2 people's legitimate grievances simultaneously without letting either calcify into position before the other had been fully heard. The Kowalski family had a border conflict with an independent operator in the northern corridor that required 40 minutes of careful language before landing on a resolution framework that both parties accepted without enthusiasm, which Seraphine had come to understand was the honest texture of durable agreements. Not satisfaction, but the willingness to live with something fair. Dante spoke twice, both times with the measured specificity of someone who had learned at significant cost the difference between taking up space and contributing to it. The second time, he offered a resource concession that cost him something real, and the room registered it, and he did not look around to see whether the room had registered it. At the end of the third hour, Seraphine called the session to close. People stood. The room loosened into the human movements of a meeting finishing, papers gathered, jackets retrieved, low conversations beginning in the margins. Mariscotti's nephew helped him to his feet. Carla Vega was already reading something on her phone. Yusuf caught Seraphine's eye across the table and gestured toward the door with a question in his face. Dinner, he was asking. The informal continuation that happened after these sessions. The part that was not on any agenda and where, frequently, more was resolved than in the official hours. She nodded. He moved toward the door. The room cleared gradually. Seraphine remained, straightening the copies of the agenda into a stack, a small mechanical task, the kind her hands did automatically while her mind processed the session. The fire exits, the language around the northern corridor framework that would need refinement before the written version was circulated. The small moment when Ronaldo Mariscotti had said something sharp across the table, and she had redirected it with a question rather than a correction, and it had worked, and she had noted the technique for future use. She became aware that Dante was still in the room. He was standing near the far wall, the one where the head table used to be, looking at the ballroom the way she had looked at it 30 minutes before the session began. His hands were in his pockets. His jacket was slightly too large across the shoulders, which she had noticed before but now noticed again. He had lost weight in the last months, the specific weight that comes off a person who has stopped performing a version of themselves that required maintenance. He didn't say anything. She finished straightening the agenda stack, placed it at the edge of the table, picked up her bag. She walked toward the doors, and as she passed him, she stopped. Not fully, not the stop of someone beginning a conversation, but the half stop of someone acknowledging a presence. The session ran well, she said. Yes, he said. You ran it well. She looked at him for a moment. His face in the chandelier light was older than it had been a year ago, which was true of her own face too, and she felt no particular way about that except that it was accurate. Come to dinner, she said. Yusuf organized it. There'll be 7 of us and the conversation will be useful. He looked at her. As a member of the compact. As a member of the compact, she said. Yes. He nodded. He fell into step beside her. Not ahead, not behind, beside. And they walked together across the ballroom floor toward the double doors. And the chandeliers threw their light across the circular table and the empty chairs, and the room that had once held a different arrangement of power and now held this one. The doors opened. The corridor beyond was lit and ordinary. They walked through. Behind them, the ballroom settled into its nighttime quiet, the chandeliers dimming on their timer, the rain audible now against the tall windows, the courtyard cobblestones dark and wet and reflecting nothing. The lanterns swinging in a wind that had no interest in what had happened here and cared only for the movement of air across old stone. The ring was not on the table. It had not been there for a long time. What remained was a document with 14 names on it, a circular table with 14 chairs, and the specific quiet of a room that had been used for something real. That was enough. That was, in the final measure, exactly enough.